Brothers and sisters of Africa, something historic is happening. A voice is rising once again from the heart of Burkina Faso. It is not just a speech. It is a declaration, a rebirth. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the man who shook the world with his courage, has just called for what he calls the African Union II, a real continental power built by Africans for Africans. This is not the African Union we know today, full of ceremonies, endless meetings and speeches that lead to nothing. No, this is different. This is the Africa of action, the Africa that defends itself, feeds itself, and governs itself. In a packed conference hall in Ouagadougou, with representatives from over 15 African nations, Traoré stood tall behind the podium, his military uniform sharp, his voice steady and thunderous. Cameras flashed. The room fell silent. Our union was not meant to beg, he began, but to build. Our fathers dreamed of an Africa that stands together, not one that kneels separately before the West. The time for talking is over. It's time to create an African Union that actually unites Africa. The crowd erupted. Delegates looked at each other, realizing they were witnessing a turning point in history. This, brothers and sisters, is how revolutions begin, not with blood but with belief. Traoré's message was simple but radical. The old African Union has failed. For years, it has been more symbolic than functional. While foreign troops still patrol African soil and Western corporations still control African minerals, the AU's response has been nothing more than statements and silence. They gave us an African Union without African power, Traoré said. A union that speaks of sovereignty but signs documents written elsewhere. The hall fell silent again. Everyone knew he was right. For decades, decisions about Africa were made in Paris, London, or Washington, not in Addis Ababa, where the AU headquarters stands. But Traoré's call was not just about criticizing the past. It was about building the future. His vision for African Union II was bold. A new continental alliance built around three pillars: military unity, economic independence, and cultural sovereignty. First, he proposed a continental defense force, a unified African military structure capable of protecting the continent without relying on NATO, France, or the United States. Every nation would contribute soldiers and resources. Training would be done locally, using African strategies suited to African terrain. We don't need foreign bases to defend our homes, he declared. We have sons and daughters who can fight for their own land if only we stand together. The audience applauded thunderously. Delegates from Mali, Niger, and Guinea rose to their feet, nodding in agreement. Then came the second pillar, economic sovereignty. Traoré revealed plans for an African Development Fund, powered by the continent's own resources: gold, oil, cocoa, uranium, and rare minerals. We sit on wealth that feeds the world, but our children go hungry, he said. That contradiction ends now. We will not sell our riches for pennies while others build empires from them. The proposal was met with a mix of excitement and disbelief. Could it really be done? Could Africa finally control its own wealth? And then came the final and most emotional pillar, cultural rebirth. Traoré spoke softly now, his tone shifting from fiery to deeply human. Before we free our lands, we must free our minds, he said. For too long we have measured progress by how close we are to Europe, not how true we are to ourselves. The African Union too will not imitate, it will inspire. His words carried the weight of generations. The dreams of Nkrumah, Sankara, Lumumba, and every leader who had died for Africa's freedom. And then he ended his address with a challenge. Let us prove that Africa is not a story of pity, but of power. Let us show the world that unity is not a dream, it's a duty. When he stepped away from the podium, the entire hall stood up. The applause lasted for several minutes. Some delegates had tears in their eyes. Outside the hall, crowds gathered, waving Burkina Faso flags and chanting his name. News cameras from across the continent broadcasted the moment live. Within hours, the speech went viral, spreading across social media, reaching millions of young Africans hungry for change. On TikTok, clips of his speech were remixed with African drums and the words "African Union 2, the rise begins." On YouTube, analysts debated whether Traoré had just sparked the beginning of a new continental era. And on the streets, ordinary people felt something they hadn't felt in decades: hope. But behind the hope, there was also fear. Because when Africa talks about unity, the world listens, and not everyone wants to see Africa united. In Western capitals, diplomats scrambled to analyze the implications. News anchors in Paris described Traoré as a rising populist voice. American commentators warned that his radical vision could destabilize Africa's existing partnerships. But to Africans, he wasn't radical, he was real. Because for the first time in decades, someone wasn't just speaking for Africa, he was speaking as Africa. And that, brothers and sisters, is how the movement for African Union 2 began, not as a dream, but as a demand. In the days that followed, the echo of Traoré's speech rippled across the continent like thunder. From Lagos to Kinshasa, from Nairobi to Bamako, people were not just talking, they were believing. The message had cut through borders, languages, and propaganda. But inside Burkina Faso, the movement was just beginning. In the capital, government officials and military advisors met behind closed doors to map out what they called Project Pan-Africa, the first step in transforming Traoré's dream of an African Union 2 into a concrete reality. Reports say the first move was building alliances, not on paper, but through trust. Traoré sent envoys to Mali, Niger, Guinea, and Chad, nations that had already taken bold stances against foreign influence. These were countries tired of being told how to govern their own lands. In Bamako, Traoré met with Mali's Assimi Goïta. The two men spoke not like presidents but like brothers. They discussed joint defense initiatives, shared resource management, and even the idea of a new African defense bank to replace dependence on the IMF and World Bank. "If we build it together," Traoré said, "no foreign power can destroy it." Goïta nodded, "And if they try, they'll face all of us." Their handshake, firm, proud, unyielding, became a symbol of African strength. Photos of that moment spread online under the hashtag #UnitedAfricaNow. But while Africa was awakening, the West was watching. In Washington, briefings warned that a new anti-Western bloc was forming in Africa. In Paris, advisors urged French leadership to contain Traoré's influence before it spreads beyond the Sahel. Media outlets tried to discredit him, labeling him a populist soldier playing with nationalism, or a puppet of other foreign powers. But the people of Africa weren't buying it. They had seen too many lies before. Traoré responded not with anger but with strategy. He held another public address, this time broadcast across several African TV networks. "They call us extremists because we dare to be free," he said calmly. "They call us radicals because we dare to think for ourselves. But tell me, what is more radical, to govern your own land or to let strangers govern it for you?" The crowd roared in approval. His words hit deep, not as politics but as truth. Meanwhile, across the continent, young Africans began organizing. Students in Senegal started open forums about Pan-African economics. Youth movements in Ghana and Tanzania hosted debates about building a new African digital currency. Artists painted murals of Traoré and other new generation African leaders, their faces surrounded by flames of unity and revolution. Music videos sampled his speeches. A generation that had grown up feeling disconnected was now rediscovering pride. But unity wasn't going to be easy. Inside the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, tension brewed. Some leaders feared Traoré's movement would undermine the organization's authority. Others quietly supported him, but hesitated to speak openly. In one private meeting, a veteran diplomat was heard saying, "Traoré speaks what we all think but fear to say." The new African Union, too, wasn't about replacing the AU. It was about reviving its purpose. Traoré's idea was to create a parallel alliance, where nations ready to act could move forward together without waiting for endless consensus. And so, by mid-year, 6 countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Guinea, Chad, and Central African Republic, had signed preliminary agreements to cooperate militarily and economically. Together, they announced the creation of the African Sovereignty Bloc. The announcement shocked the world. Western newspapers called it a geopolitical earthquake. African youth called it the beginning. Traoré made it clear this wasn't about war. It was about respect. "We do not seek conflict," he said in a calm but powerful tone. "We seek independence. If others feel threatened by that, then it is because they have built their power on our weakness." As the alliance strengthened, plans emerged for a continental training base, where young African soldiers would learn not only combat, but leadership, diplomacy, and technology. The training would combine traditional knowledge with modern innovation. "Our strength is not in copying others," Traoré told the gathered commanders. "Our strength is in remembering who we are." He paused, then continued. "We are the descendants of empires that built cities before Europe even dreamed of them. We do not need permission to rise." The applause that followed echoed across the desert night. And while these moves unfolded, another silent battle began, an economic one. Burkina Faso and its allies started preparing to ditch foreign currencies in regional trade. Instead, they proposed a gold-backed digital currency, one managed by African institutions, not Western central banks. Economists called it risky. People called it revolutionary. On social media, it was trending everywhere. "Gold for Africa, Traoré plan new union." In just a few months, Africa had gone from being called unstable to uncontrollable. In Europe, leaders held emergency discussions about the collapse of Western influence in Africa. In Washington, intelligence briefings noted, "The alliance led by Burkina Faso is gaining traction faster than expected." But Traoré was not done. The second phase of his plan was already underway, one that would shake the foundations of African politics and test whether unity could truly survive pressure. He told his advisors one night in Ouagadougou, "They will try to divide us. They will use money, threats, and fear, but we must hold the line. This time we will not break." And with those words, the African Union too began its next chapter. The chapter that would make the world finally realize that Africa was no longer asking for change. It was creating it. As Traoré's vision spread like wildfire across Africa, the world's major powers started to panic. Reports from Western intelligence agencies described him as the most unpredictable African leader in decades. But what they didn't understand was that Traoré wasn't unpredictable, he was unstoppable. The African Union, too, once dismissed as a fantasy, was now a rapidly forming coalition. Military officials were already drawing plans for joint defense zones, while economists were studying how to redirect African exports toward friendly markets, Asia, the Middle East, and even Latin America. And behind closed doors in Ouagadougou, Traoré unveiled the next part of his plan, the Continental Defense Pact. The room was filled with generals, ministers, and advisors. The air was heavy with tension. Traoré stood at the head of the long wooden table and said, "They've controlled us through debt, through fear, through lies. But now they will fear our unity. This pact, this brotherhood, will make sure no African nation stands alone again." Maps of Africa were spread out before him, covered in circles and lines showing shared borders, transport routes, and strategic points. From Mali to Chad, from Burkina Faso to the Central African Republic, if one is attacked, we all respond. No more waiting for foreign peacekeepers. We will defend ourselves. His words carried the weight of centuries of struggle. That night the document was signed by 6 nations, and by dawn, it was being called the Sahel Shield Agreement. Western analysts went into overdrive. A leaked memo from the U.S. State Department described it as a serious threat to Western geopolitical interests in the region. French media labeled Traoré the architect of a new anti-Western bloc. But inside Africa, people were celebrating. On the streets of Ouagadougou, young people waved flags and chanted, "Africa for Africans." In Mali and Niger, crowds gathered outside government buildings, cheering for unity. Social media exploded with the words, "We are no longer colonies, we are a continent reborn." Meanwhile, Traoré's administration began the enormous task of rebuilding Africa's military independence. Old weapons donated by foreign powers were replaced with local manufacturing projects. Engineers and blacksmiths in Burkina Faso collaborated to produce drones, armored vehicles, and tactical gear made entirely with African resources. "We may not have billions," Traoré told his engineers, "but we have brilliance." Across Africa, training academies began to exchange officers and students, forming a new generation of African leaders who would grow up thinking beyond borders. The goal was clear: one Africa, one defense, one destiny. But with every move forward came new challenges. By mid-year, reports emerged that Western aid programs were being quietly cut from Burkina Faso and its allies. International media pushed stories painting Traoré as a dictator and a threat to democracy. Sanctions were discussed in European parliaments. Yet Traoré remained calm. In one televised address, he looked straight into the camera and said, "You call it democracy when we obey you, but when we stand for ourselves, you call it defiance. I call it freedom." The world was watching, and so were Africa's youth. His words turned into music lyrics, posters, memes, and documentaries. He wasn't just a leader anymore. He was a movement. Behind the scenes, however, a new struggle was brewing. Several African leaders, nervous about losing Western funding, began to hesitate. They feared what would happen if they fully joined the new African Union too. Traoré didn't pressure them. Instead, he extended a hand. "Join us not out of anger," he told them, "but out of hope. This is not about revenge, it's about respect." And slowly, the resistance began to fade. Nigeria's youth organizations called for their government to stand with the Sahel. Kenya's press began running editorials about the rebirth of African sovereignty. Even South Africa's parliament debated cooperation with the new alliance. It was working. But as the movement grew, so did the efforts to sabotage it. Anonymous sources revealed that foreign agents were trying to infiltrate media networks to discredit the new African Pact. Rumors spread about secret coups and hidden agendas. Traoré knew this game. It was the same playbook used for decades to divide African nations. He called an emergency summit in Ouagadougou. The leaders of Mali, Niger, Guinea, and Chad arrived under tight security. The meeting lasted through the night. At dawn, Traoré emerged and faced the cameras. His face was calm, but his voice was steel. "Let them try," he said. "Let them send their spies, their lies, their bribes. We will not bow. We are the sons and daughters of a continent that has suffered enough. And now we rise." The crowd outside erupted in cheers that echoed for miles. International observers noted something different that day. This wasn't a mere alliance of governments. It was a spiritual uprising. Across Africa, artists began to paint new murals. Maps of the continent linked with chains breaking apart, eagles flying over deserts, and Traoré's silhouette rising in gold light. And for the first time, major African broadcasters agreed to jointly produce a new media platform called Voice of the New Africa, designed to counter foreign propaganda and tell Africa's story by Africans for Africans. It was clear now this wasn't just politics anymore. It was history in motion. Traoré had lit the spark, but the fire belonged to the people. Still, one question lingered. Could the dream survive the storm that was coming? Because while Africa was rising, powerful forces beyond its shores were preparing their next move. In Washington, London, and Paris, meetings were already underway not to cooperate, but to contain this new revolution. And the first sign of that pushback was about to hit Burkina Faso's borders, testing everything the young leader had built. The night sky over Ouagadougou was quiet, too quiet. A faint hum of distant aircraft could be heard, and the alert systems inside Burkina Faso's new command center began flashing red. Intelligence officers rushed to their stations. A coded message appeared on the main screen. Unidentified foreign drones detected near the northern border. The room froze. Traoré stepped forward, his uniform crisp, his expression calm but unreadable. "They've made their move," he said softly. "The test begins now." Within minutes, the situation escalated. Several drones violated Burkina Faso's airspace, the first direct act of intimidation since the formation of the African Union too. No country claimed responsibility, but the origin of the signals traced back to a Western military base in North Africa. Instead of panic, Traoré's command team followed a protocol that had been months in the making, a joint defense operation with neighboring nations. Within an hour, radar stations in Mali, Niger, and Guinea were online, feeding data into a single system. For the first time in African history, an African-led defense grid was active, independent of NATO or Western oversight. "No foreign soldier will decide our fate again," Traoré said firmly. The drones were intercepted by anti-air systems built in partnership with African and Russian engineers. No casualties, no damage, just a clear message to the world: Africa was no longer defenseless. The next morning, Western media erupted. Headlines screamed, "Burkina Faso provokes the West. African military rising, a threat to stability." But inside Africa, the story was different. Broadcasters from the Voice of the New Africa network showed the truth, how unity had protected their skis. Citizens across the continent cheered, waving flags, posting on social media, celebrating a new sense of strength. In one viral clip, a Burkinabe woman said tearfully, "For the first time, I don't fear what will happen if the world turns against us, because we are no longer alone." Meanwhile, Western diplomats scrambled for damage control. Private memos from Washington and Paris, later leaked, revealed growing panic. One French official wrote, "If this African Union too continues to consolidate, France will lose all strategic influence in West Africa within 5 years." But it was already too late. At the African Unity Summit that followed, leaders from over 20 nations gathered under one banner, not the blue flag of the old African Union, but a new emblem, a golden sun rising behind the map of Africa, surrounded by the words, "One people, one power." Traoré took the stage. Cameras rolled across the continent. Millions watched live. "My brothers and sisters," he began, his voice echoing through the hall, "they have called us rebels, radicals, even terrorists. But they fear not our weapons, they fear our minds. They fear a generation that has stopped asking for permission to be free." The audience roared with applause. "When they sent missionaries, they took our gold. When they sent soldiers, they took our lands. When they sent aid, they took our dignity. But now we send a message to the world. Africa does not need saving, Africa is saving itself." He paused, looking out over the sea of faces, leaders, generals, activists, students, the future of a continent reborn. The African Union, too, is not a club of politicians. It is a covenant of people. From the Sahara to the Cape, from the Nile to the Congo, our destiny is no longer written in foreign ink. It is written in the soil, the sweat, and the spirit of our people. The cameras zoomed in. His eyes burned with conviction. To the powers that once ruled us, we say, no more deals made in secret. No more bases built on our soil. No more lectures about democracy from those who destroyed it. If you wish to speak with Africa, you speak as equals or not at all. The room erupted into thunderous applause. Outside, crowds gathered in cities across the continent. Massive screens broadcast his words live. In Nairobi, Dakar, Accra, Bamako, and Johannesburg, the same chant filled the air. Africa, Africa, Africa. Within hours, those words became a global trend. Even African diasporas in New York, Paris, and London joined the movement, waving flags and shouting Traoré's name. But amid the celebrations, Traoré remained cautious. He knew history's pattern. Whenever Africa rose, someone tried to break it apart. Later that evening, he met with his closest advisors in the presidential compound. The mood was somber but proud. "We have started something that cannot be stopped," said one general. "Yes," Traoré replied, "but we must protect it with discipline. The world will test our unity. If we stand firm now, our grandchildren will never kneel again." They raised their glasses in silence, not to toast victory, but to honor the struggle ahead. The following week, African economists met to finalize plans for a continental trade network, using local currencies and gold-backed exchanges, bypassing the dollar system entirely. The foundations of a new economic order were being laid, brick by brick, African hand by African hand. And as the world watched, one message became clear. Africa was no longer reacting to history, it was writing it. In a closing address broadcast to the world, Traoré stood before the African flag, no longer the old emblem of compromise, but a new banner of power and purpose. "They will call us dreamers," he said, "but remember, every empire began as a dream. Let ours begin not with conquest but with courage. Africa's time has come, and no one can turn back the sunrise." The music swelled, the crowd roared, and the cameras faded out on Traoré's determined face, a symbol of a continent reclaiming its destiny. If you believe in Africa's rise, if you believe in voices that refuse to be silenced, then make sure to subscribe, because this revolution is just getting started.